The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets. It was the kind of day that made you feel as if everything was aligned perfectly. The air was crisp and the world seemed just a little bit brighter. For the young woman in the crimson dress, the day had been a long time coming. She had spent months preparing for this moment. Today, everything was about to change. The event she was heading to wasn't just another social gathering. It was an important one, an opportunity to show her talent, to stand out, and to prove to herself and everyone else that she was capable of achieving her dreams. She had worked tirelessly to reach this point, and now it was her moment to shine. With a deep breath, she adjusted the rearview mirror, straightened her dress, and started her car. The smooth hum of the engine was comforting. The radio played softly in the background, setting a relaxed mood. She had planned the journey to the venue meticulously, giving herself plenty of time to get there early, make a good impression, and be fully prepared. As she drove, her thoughts were consumed by the event ahead. She had done everything she could to prepare for it, and now all she had to do was show up and perform her best. But as she turned onto the main road, she noticed something strange in her rearview mirror. A police car was following her closely. At first, she didn't think much of it. After all, she was driving safely, and the area wasn't known for much traffic. The police car could have been on a routine patrol, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the seconds ticked by, she realized the car was staying too close and the siren was starting to sound. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't unusual for people to get nervous when they saw flashing lights in their rearview mirror. But today, with everything on the line, her nerves were heightened. She checked her speed. She hadn't been speeding, but she couldn't help but wonder why the officer was pulling her over. Could it be something as simple as a broken taillight, or was there something more? She pulled over to the side of the road, her fingers gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. The police car parked behind her, its lights flashing in a blur of red and blue. She couldn't help but glance around nervously. There were only a few cars on the road, and they all seemed to slow down as they passed, their drivers eyeing her with curiosity. She tried to calm herself, reminding herself that this was just a simple traffic stop. The officer stepped out of the car. His movements were sharp and purposeful, a clear sign of authority. She could feel the weight of his gaze as he approached, his eyes scanning her car. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't offering a friendly greeting. His expression was serious and his steps were deliberate. It wasn't uncommon for officers to be stern, especially on traffic stops. But something about his demeanor felt different, more intense. She rolled down her window and forced a smile, hoping it would ease the tension. "Good evening, officer. Is there something wrong?" The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he asked for her driver's license and registration, his voice cold and businesslike. She was taken aback. She hadn't done anything wrong, at least nothing she was aware of. But she complied, reaching for her purse and pulling out the necessary documents. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed them over. She knew she shouldn't be scared, but the situation felt unfamiliar and her nerves were beginning to take over. The officer glanced at the documents briefly before returning his gaze to her. "Step out of the vehicle," he said abruptly. The request was unexpected and she froze for a moment. Step out of the vehicle? Why, was something wrong? She had been polite and cooperative, and yet the officer was asking her to get out of the car for no clear reason. She glanced around, hoping to see someone who might explain the situation, but the road was still quiet, and there was no one in sight. "Is there a reason you need me to get out?" she asked cautiously, her voice a little shaky. "Just get out of the car," the officer repeated, his tone firm, almost impatient. "Now!" The command hung in the air, and for a split second she considered refusing. But that would only make things worse. The last thing she wanted was to escalate the situation. Slowly, she opened the door and stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement. She tried to keep her movements calm, but her heart was racing. She wasn't sure what was happening, but everything about this felt wrong. As she stood next to her car, the officer didn't speak for a moment. He just looked at her, his eyes scanning her appearance as though assessing something she couldn't understand. It was uncomfortable, the silence hanging between them, and the more she thought about it, the more she felt exposed. She had never been in a situation like this before, and she wasn't sure how to react. Finally, the officer spoke again, his voice still sharp. "You were speeding. I need to check your license." She blinked, surprised. Speeding? She knew she hadn't been speeding. She had made sure to drive carefully, especially with so much on her mind. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the situation. Was this some kind of misunderstanding? She had no idea why he would accuse her of speeding, but she had no choice but to comply with his instructions. She handed him her license once again, though this time her hands were shaking more than before. Without another word, the officer walked back to his car, leaving her standing there, her nerves frayed. She felt the weight of the moment, the pressure building with every second that passed. The minutes stretched on endlessly. Her thoughts swirled, and she found herself replaying the events over and over. What had she done wrong? Why was she being treated this way? The officer returned a few minutes later, his expression unchanged. He handed her the ticket for speeding, though she still couldn't understand why. She took the ticket, her hands now trembling, but she didn't say anything. What could she say? Her voice felt small in the face of this situation, her frustration bubbling under the surface but unable to break through. "Sign here," the officer said, pointing to the line on the ticket. She nodded and signed, still not fully understanding what had just happened. As she did, the officer gave her one final look, turned on his heel and walked back to his patrol car. She stood there watching him go, feeling a mixture of confusion and anger building inside her. Just as she was about to get back into her car, she heard the unmistakable sound of another vehicle approaching quickly. The sleek black car sped past her, the sound of its engine roaring in the stillness of the evening. But it didn't just pass by. It screeched to a halt just a few feet ahead of her, blocking her way. She watched, startled, as the tinted windows rolled down and a familiar voice called out. It was a voice that seemed to cut through the tension in the air, commanding attention. The sudden appearance of the governor stunned everyone. For a moment, the young woman stood frozen, not quite sure how to react. She had been so caught up in the intensity of the traffic stop that the appearance of such an important figure felt surreal. She had only ever seen the governor on television, not in real life, and certainly not in a situation like this. The governor's black car, sleek and polished, seemed to add a sense of urgency to the scene. The sound of its engine slowing down was drowned out by the stillness that now hung in the air. The officer, who had been standing at a distance, immediately tensed up. His posture shifted from one of authority to something more defensive, as if the arrival of the governor had caught him off guard. The young woman noticed the shift, but she couldn't understand why the officer looked so shaken. He had been so confident just moments ago, but now he seemed almost unsure. It was clear that something had changed, but what exactly? The governor's car doors opened slowly and he stepped out, his presence commanding but calm. His suit was well-tailored and his face, though serious, held an air of professionalism. He didn't rush or make any sudden movements. Instead, he took measured steps toward the officer, his eyes briefly meeting the young woman's before he addressed the situation. "Is there a problem here?" The governor's voice was smooth, with an underlying authority that immediately put the officer on notice. The question wasn't just polite small talk, it carried weight. It was clear that the governor was asking because he had every right to, and he expected a proper answer. The officer didn't respond right away. His mouth opened as if to speak, but then closed again, his words tangled in a web of uncertainty. It was rare for him to be questioned by anyone, let alone someone with the governor's stature. He stood stiff, caught between explaining himself and maintaining his control over the situation. The young woman still standing by her car couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. She had felt so small under the officer's scrutiny, as though everything she did was being watched, analyzed, and judged. But now, with the governor there, the power dynamics had shifted completely. She wasn't alone anymore. The man who had once seemed so distant and intimidating was now flanked by someone who could not only understand what had happened but also make sure it was addressed fairly. The officer cleared his throat and straightened his posture, though his discomfort was still apparent. I pulled her over for speeding," he said, his voice a little more strained than before. He seemed almost reluctant to explain himself, as though he knew the situation was about to be questioned in ways he hadn't anticipated. She was going over the limit. The governor's eyes flicked to the young woman, who was now trying to compose herself, her hands still trembling slightly. She had been told she was speeding, but she knew without a doubt that she hadn't been. She had driven carefully, knowing how important it was to stay composed on the road, especially when there was so much at stake for her. The governor turned back to the officer, his expression unreadable. "I see," he said. the tone of his voice neither dismissive nor aggressive, just a calm acknowledgement of the officer's words. "And can you tell me why you ordered her out of the vehicle?" His question hung in the air, and the officer shifted uncomfortably. The officer hesitated, clearly unprepared for the governor's scrutiny. He looked down at his feet for a moment, and the young woman could see the tension in his jaw. "She was being difficult," he muttered under his breath, though the words felt hollow. It wasn't a convincing explanation, not when the governor was listening. The young woman raised her eyebrows, surprised by the officer's response. Difficult? She hadn't been difficult. She had been polite, asking questions when she was confused, and yet here was the officer making it sound as though she had been the problem. She opened her mouth, ready to defend herself, but the governor held up a hand, signaling for her to remain quiet. "You don't get to treat people like that," the governor said, his voice firm but calm. He wasn't raising it, yet there was something in the way he spoke that made the officer stand a little straighter. "I don't know the specifics of your previous encounters, but I do know that the law is meant to protect people, not intimidate them." The officer swallowed hard. His face reddened as he tried to find something to say, but the words didn't come. The young woman could see the shift in his demeanor. His confidence was gone, replaced with uncertainty. The governor's words weren't just a reprimand. They were a reminder of what it meant to serve and protect the people, not to use power as a means to control or harm. For a moment, the young woman felt the tension in the air begin to lift. The governor had made it clear that he wasn't going to let this slide, that he would hold the officer accountable. She had no idea what would happen next, but she felt safer knowing that someone in a position of power cared enough to intervene. The governor then turned his attention back to her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer now, though still carrying the weight of authority. It was a simple question, but in that moment it made all the difference. The young woman nodded, a small, grateful smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It was the first time in what felt like ages that someone had asked how she was truly doing, and it meant more than she could say. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steadier now. She was still shaken, but the support from the governor was like a steady hand guiding her through the storm. "I wasn't speeding. I don't know why he pulled me over." The governor nodded thoughtfully, his gaze never leaving her. "We'll take care of it," he assured her. "I'll personally make sure this is looked into." He turned his attention back to the officer, his demeanor never wavering. "You'll be reporting this incident to your superior, and I want a full explanation." The officer, now looking a little defeated, nodded stiffly. There wasn't much he could do in the face of the governor's authority. "Yes, sir," he muttered. The governor took a step back, allowing the officer to finish up whatever paperwork he needed to complete. He turned back to the young woman, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again," he said, his words sincere. "No one deserves to be treated this way." She nodded, her heart still racing, but now with a sense of relief. She wasn't alone anymore. The situation was no longer just her against the officer. It was the law against injustice, and the governor had her back. As the officer finished writing the ticket and walked back to his car, the governor stayed by her side, ensuring that everything was handled properly. The young woman didn't know what would come of this, but in that moment she knew one thing for sure. Her life had just changed. The day had begun with uncertainty and fear, but it was ending with hope. Hope that things could be different, that justice could prevail, and that she had the strength to stand up for herself, no matter what. As the officer drove away, the young woman and the governor exchanged a final look. It was a silent understanding between them. The governor didn't need to say anything more. The message had been made clear. The young woman wasn't just another person in a sea of faces. She was someone who deserved respect, dignity, and fairness, and she wasn't about to let anyone forget that. The scene had changed entirely after the governor's intervention. The young woman stood by her car trying to gather her thoughts, still feeling the shock of the encounter. The tension in her chest had started to ease, but her mind was still racing. How had it gotten to this point? How had she gone from a simple drive to being caught up in such a strange and unsettling situation? The officer had pulled her over for something she knew she hadn't done, and it took the governor himself to step in and offer her any sense of relief. As the officer finished his paperwork, the governor turned to her one last time before he climbed back into his car. He gave her a reassuring smile, his voice calm and steady. "I'll personally look into this. You won't be left in the dark about what happens next," he assured her. The young woman nodded, feeling a slight weight lift off her shoulders. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that he would follow through. He had already shown more concern for her than anyone else had in the past few hours. She watched as the governor's car drove away, the sound of the engine slowly fading into the distance. For a few minutes, she stood there, staring at the officer's car as it pulled away as well. The moment felt surreal. It was like she had just stepped out of one reality and into another. Everything she had experienced in the last few minutes had left her questioning so much about how the system worked, how people in positions of power treated others, and how quickly a peaceful day could be turned upside down. But there was something about the way the governor had handled the situation that gave her a small, yet powerful sense of hope. The officer's car had left, and the road was silent again, except for the occasional passing vehicle. The young woman took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. The reality of what had happened was settling in. She had been treated unfairly. It was clear now. She wasn't sure what had caused the officer to react the way he did, but the truth was undeniable. She had done nothing wrong, yet she had been made to feel small and insignificant. And it was only when someone with real authority had intervened that the situation was corrected. But there was more to the story than just that. The governor's appearance hadn't been just a moment of relief. It had triggered something in her. She was no longer just a bystander in her own life, someone who had to take whatever came her way. There was power in standing up for yourself, even if that power had been handed to her unexpectedly. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew one thing. This wasn't over. With her hands still shaking slightly, she climbed back into her car and started the engine. The event she had been preparing for was still on her mind, but she couldn't help but think about the larger implications of what had just happened. What if it had been someone else, someone who didn't have the governor's support, someone who didn't know how to fight back? The young woman knew that if she hadn't been as calm as she was, things might have turned out differently. As she continued to drive, her thoughts drifted to the feeling of powerlessness that many people experienced. For a brief moment, she had been made to feel like she was the problem, like she was the one who had done something wrong. But what if the officer had been wrong from the start? What if there were others out there who didn't have someone like the governor to help them? That thought made her uneasy. She pulled into the parking lot of the venue, the event she had been heading to still ahead of her. The night was falling, and the lights from the building ahead seemed to shimmer in the distance. For a moment, she just sat in her car, staring at the lights, trying to center herself. The nerves from earlier were back, but now they felt different. It wasn't just about the event anymore. It was about standing tall in the face of adversity. It was about being seen and heard, even when everything seemed stacked against you. Taking one last deep breath, she grabbed her purse and opened the door to exit the car. As she walked towards the building, she tried to push the earlier events from her mind. She had worked too hard to let them distract her from what was truly important. This moment. She had earned the right to be there, to be in that space, and nothing, not even the strange and unfair treatment from the officer, could take that away. Inside the venue, the atmosphere was completely different. The soft hum of conversations filled the air, and the sounds of people mingling and laughing brought a sense of normalcy that she desperately needed. The nerves in her stomach settled a little as she greeted a few familiar faces and made her way through the crowd. The people around her didn't know what she had just been through, and she didn't want to share it with them. She wasn't there to make excuses. She was there to show the world who she was. But the incident hadn't left her completely. The young woman tried to focus on the conversations around her, but every now and then her thoughts wandered back to the officer, to the governor, and to the feeling of being wronged. She couldn't help but wonder about what was happening behind the scenes. What would the officer say in his report? What would happen now that the governor had intervened? She knew the wheels of bureaucracy moved slowly, but she also knew that something had shifted. Her role in the world had changed. By the time the event began, she was still trying to steady herself. She had made it through the early moments, but she was unsure how she was going to manage the rest of the evening. Her heart wasn't completely in the event now. She had been jolted out of her usual focus, and the lingering thoughts about the earlier encounter clouded her mind. But as the program started and she took her seat in the front row, something shifted within her. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough to give her a small sense of control. As the speakers began, she listened carefully, taking notes and observing how everyone else around her was reacting. She had been in these situations before, but tonight felt different. Her mind wasn't just focused on the speeches or the event. It was thinking about something bigger, about how easily power could be misused and how rare it was for someone in power to step in and make things right. The governor had done that for her, but how many others would never get that chance? When it was her turn to speak, she stood up, a bit nervous but determined. She had a story to tell, one that wasn't just about herself but about everyone who had ever been made to feel small by those in authority. She didn't have the answers yet, but she knew she needed to be heard. And for the first time, she felt like her voice really mattered. As she stood at the podium looking out at the crowd, she knew this was a defining moment for her. The incident with the officer and the governor had become more than just an isolated event. It had opened her eyes to the fact that speaking up was not just a right, but a responsibility. No one else was going to change the world for her. She had to take that step herself. When the evening ended, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. It wasn't just the event that she had conquered. It was the way she had stood her ground. And as she left the venue, the memory of the officer, of the governor's support, and of the quiet power she now felt within herself lingered. Whatever came next, she knew she was ready to face it head on. The days that followed were a blur of emotions and uncertainty. The young woman couldn't help but replay the events over and over in her mind. What had happened on that road seemed so surreal, but it had left an impact on her that she couldn't shake. The encounter with the officer, the sudden appearance of the governor, and the way the entire situation had unfolded had changed her in ways she didn't fully understand yet. But one thing was clear. She was no longer the same person she had been before that day. The news of what had happened spread quickly, though not in the way she expected. It wasn't just about her anymore. It became a symbol of something larger. People began talking about the incident, some defending the officer's actions, others questioning his behavior, but the governor's involvement was widely seen as a moment of accountability that the community needed. Her part in the story was still fresh in the minds of those who had witnessed it, but she tried not to dwell on the attention. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about the bigger picture. The young woman had received several calls from news outlets, people asking for interviews, wanting to hear her side of the story. She had turned most of them down. The last thing she wanted was to become a spectacle. She wasn't looking for fame, nor was she looking for sympathy. She just wanted answers. And more than anything, she wanted to make sure this kind of thing didn't happen to anyone else. But there was something that had shifted in her, an awareness of the power that came with speaking out. She had always known that her voice mattered, but this experience had shown her just how much weight it could carry. The governor's support had given her a sense of validation, a feeling that what had happened to her wasn't something she should just brush off. It was something that needed to be addressed. She wasn't alone, and there were people who cared enough to help her find the truth. Despite her desire for privacy, she couldn't escape the way her life had changed since the incident. She found herself thinking more critically about the world around her, wondering how many people had experienced the same kind of treatment or worse, without anyone stepping in to help. She had felt helpless in that moment on the side of the road, but the governor's arrival had shown her that help was possible. There were still people out there who believed in doing what was right, and that knowledge had given her a newfound sense of hope. In the days that followed, the officer who had stopped her was placed under review. The governor's office had made sure that an investigation was conducted into his actions, and though the process was slow, the young woman could feel that something was happening. It wasn't just a matter of clearing her name anymore. It was about making sure that the officer's behavior wasn't swept under the rug. There had to be accountability. The young woman knew she couldn't control the outcome of the investigation, but she could do her part. She contacted the governor's office, providing her account of what had happened that day. She wanted to be as clear as possible about the officer's behavior, about how it had made her feel, and about how it had all unfolded. She wasn't angry anymore, not at the officer, not at the system, but she was determined. She wanted to make sure no one else ever had to experience what she had gone through. Life had a way of continuing on, regardless of personal turmoil, and the young woman's routine began to return to normal. She went back to work, back to the things she had been doing before the incident, but there was a quiet strength in her now, an understanding that things weren't always what they seemed, and that it was okay to question what didn't feel right. One afternoon, as she was walking home from work, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from a friend she hadn't spoken to in a while. The message was simple. "Have you heard about the rally tomorrow? It's for accountability. It's because of what happened to you." Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. She wasn't one to seek attention, but the idea of people coming together to speak out, to support the cause of accountability, struck a chord with her. It was the kind of thing that could make a difference, the kind of thing that could change the way things worked. The next day, she found herself standing in a crowd of people outside a local government building. The rally had gathered a diverse group, all united by the need for change. The air was filled with a sense of purpose, and for the first time in a long while, the young woman felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. She wasn't just one person speaking out anymore. She was part of a movement, a call for fairness, respect, and accountability in the systems that governed their lives. As she listened to the speeches, the young woman felt a deep sense of solidarity with those around her. They were all there for the same reason, to make sure that no one else would have to endure what she had gone through. The experience had made her realize that her story was not unique. There were countless others who had been unfairly treated, who had been overlooked or dismissed because of their race, their gender, or their background. She had been one of the lucky ones. She had had someone in power to step in when things went wrong. But not everyone had that kind of support. The rally continued, with speakers calling for reform, for better training for officers, and for more oversight of law enforcement practices. There was an energy in the crowd, a sense of unity and resolve. The young woman, standing among them, felt like she had finally found her place in the world. She wasn't just an innocent bystander anymore. She was part of the conversation. Her voice, however small, mattered. As the rally came to an end, the young woman found herself feeling something she hadn't expected. Pride. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the people who had shown up to speak out, all the people who had decided that enough was enough. It was about the idea that no one should have to go through what she had experienced, and that together they could make a difference. Over the next few weeks, the investigation into the officers' actions continued. The young woman didn't hear much from the governor's office, but she knew the wheels of justice were slowly turning. She had done everything she could, and now it was up to the system to work. The officers' behavior had been inappropriate, but she also understood that change wasn't instantaneous. It took time, effort, and persistence. The governor had made sure her voice had been heard, and now it was time for others to do the same. As time went on, the young woman became more involved in local advocacy. She found herself attending meetings, speaking to others who had similar stories, and working with community leaders to push for reform. What had started as a personal experience had turned into a larger mission, one that she felt passionately about. The officer's fate was still unknown, but the young woman no longer focused on that. Her journey had taught her something important. Change didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. And it was up to each of them, every person who had been wronged or overlooked, to speak up, to make sure their voices were heard, and to hold the system accountable. She had found her voice that day on the side of the road, and she was going to use it to make sure that no one else ever had to face the same kind of injustice she had. The weeks following the rally were a blur of emotions, phone calls, and new experiences. The young woman found herself in a place she never thought she would be, standing at the intersection of change and possibility. Her life had shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated, and while she didn't know exactly where the road would take her, she felt a sense of purpose that was stronger than ever. The investigation into the officers' actions was still ongoing, but there was a noticeable shift in how people around her treated the situation. Her friends and colleagues reached out more, expressing their support, not just for her, but for the cause she had unintentionally become a part of. She hadn't set out to be a spokesperson for justice, but she had become one. The officer, too, was under increased scrutiny, and the governor's office had promised to keep her updated on the progress of the investigation. But even as her community rallied around her, there were moments when she couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had happened. The attention was overwhelming at times. She had always been a private person, someone who preferred to blend into the background, but now she found herself in the spotlight, and the thought of being constantly watched was exhausting. It wasn't about her, it never had been. But in a world that seemed to crave drama and sensational stories, her personal experience had been turned into something more. She wasn't just a woman who had been mistreated by a police officer. She had become a symbol for something much bigger. In the quiet moments when she allowed herself to pause, the reality of what had happened on that fateful day on the side of the road would flood her mind. She had been just like everyone else, trying to go about her day focused on the things that mattered. But suddenly, she had found herself in the middle of an encounter that had shaken her to her core. It wasn't just the officer's actions that had troubled her. It was the sense of helplessness that had followed. How many others had faced the same treatment? How many had been made to feel small, to feel as if they didn't matter? But as the investigation into the officer continued and the rally had shown her the strength of community support, something began to shift inside her. She wasn't the only one who had been wronged. There were countless others, their voices just waiting to be heard. And maybe, just maybe, her story could be the catalyst for something greater than herself. The first sign that things were changing came when the governor's office called her in for a meeting. She had been expecting an update, but what she didn't expect was the gravity of the conversation. When she arrived, she was greeted by a team of officials, and the room was filled with a mix of seriousness and determination. The governor himself was there, looking more focused than she had ever seen him. "We've completed the review of the officer's conduct," the governor began, his voice steady and calm. "And we've taken steps to ensure that what happened to you doesn't happen again. There will be consequences for his actions, but more importantly, we're looking at systemic changes to prevent future incidents." The young woman's heart pounded in her chest. She had been expecting some sort of resolution, but hearing that there would be consequences for the officer's behavior felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She hadn't done this for retribution, but knowing that someone would be held accountable made her feel as though the system could actually work. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure that no one else had to face what she had faced. The governor continued, explaining that the officer would be placed on administrative leave pending further review, and there would be a review of his past conduct. The department, too, would undergo new training aimed at improving how officers interacted with the community, particularly people of color. It was clear that they were taking this seriously, but the young woman also knew that true change would take time. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be immediate. But the fact that the conversation was happening at all gave her hope. The meeting ended with a sense of mutual understanding. The young woman left the governor's office with a mix of emotions. She was relieved, but there was also a sense of pride in knowing that her story had sparked something. She wasn't naive enough to believe that everything was perfect now, but she understood that change was a slow process. It didn't happen in a single moment or with a single decision, but it started with one person speaking up, one person making sure their voice was heard. As the days passed, the officer's fate seemed to settle into the background. It wasn't that it didn't matter, it did. But for the young woman, it was no longer the focal point. The real work had just begun. She had found a new sense of purpose, and it was clear that her role in this larger movement was just beginning to take shape. She began speaking at community events, sharing her story not as a victim, but as someone who had experienced something that was far too common and who now wanted to be part of the solution. She wasn't doing this for recognition. She wasn't doing it for praise. She was doing it because she wanted to make sure that others didn't feel the way she had felt that day on the side of the road. Her message was clear. Everyone deserved respect. Everyone deserved to feel safe, no matter their background, no matter where they came from. And when injustice occurred, it needed to be addressed, not just for the individual, but for the larger community. As she continued her advocacy, something remarkable happened. People began to reach out to her, sharing their own stories. They weren't just talking about police misconduct. They were talking about their experiences in everyday life. Experiences where they had been overlooked, ignored, or made to feel less than. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a much larger pattern that needed to be addressed. The young woman realized that her role had changed once again. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. She was part of a larger movement, one that was pushing for real, lasting change. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but with each conversation, with each story shared, the momentum built. It was as if the floodgates had opened and the voices that had been silenced for so long were finally being heard. The governor, too, continued to show support for the movement. His office remained involved, pushing for reforms at the state level. The young woman didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt as though the system was actually working for the people, not against them. As months passed, the officer's disciplinary review concluded. He was fired from the force, and though the young woman had never sought vengeance, seeing that justice had been done gave her a sense of closure. It wasn't just about his removal, it was about the message it sent. It was about the fact that for once someone had been held accountable for their actions. With each passing day, the young woman grew more confident in her role within the movement. She was no longer just a bystander in her own life. She had found her voice, and she was determined to use it. Her journey wasn't over, and the road ahead would still be challenging. But she knew that as long as she had a voice, she would continue to speak out for justice.